Fellows, and that one lady. Welcome back to the 10-Minute Bitcoin Show. Gonna get you out of here before the next block. We made some waves yesterday, guys. We made some waves. We talked about some words. We provided some definitions for said words. And then we extrapolated. And you know what? A lot of people around here, they don't like it when you do that. They don't like it, guys, when you define words, say what you mean, when you use those words, right? See, in my opinion, it's impossible to talk about anything ever and have a productive conversation without making sure that you and the person you're talking to agree on the definition of words. Frankly, I don't really care what definitions you use, but I need to make sure that I understand what definitions you use. That's why when we had our discussion yesterday, I made it very clear what my definitions are of hard fork and soft fork. And you know, I got a lot of pushback from a lot of Ethereum people. I wouldn't even call it pushback. I got a lot of very salty tears from Ethereum people who were really upset about me suggesting that Ethereum's 18 hard forks were mandatory upgrades. Guys, I'm sorry you don't like the reality, but that's just what a hard fork is. It is a mandatory upgrade. If you want to stay in consensus and the majority of the network is going in the direction of a hard fork, you have to upgrade. Like, I understand that makes your brain implode because it doesn't fit inside of your goofy little crypto narratives, but hard forks are mandatory upgrades, guys. They're not backwards compatible changes. You have to upgrade. And the whole Ethereum Classic split, you know, there's this interesting thing that happens in crypto where there's like these social consensuses that emerge. We're going to talk about this as we get back to the Bitcoin part of things, because I don't want to just talk about shitcoins. But shitcoins, they're good examples, guys. There's so many examples that we can learn from as Bitcoiners. Without wanting to own the shitcoins, we can learn valuable lessons about how distributed consensuses are maintained and how they emerge and what cults of personality look like. Yeah, I forgot where I was going with it, but oh yeah, the Ethereum Classic split after the DAO hack. So, you know, Ethereum purged a lot of its decentralized, bottom-up, grassroots-minded people early on, right? When it split into Ethereum Classic. And then every hard fork after that, right? Like, yeah, there maybe could have been another split, like another contentious split after the Ethereum Classic fork, but they had already gotten rid of most of those people. So by the time you get to the point where like you're just plowing ahead with hard forks as a design philosophy, like there is no meaningful population. There might be some disgruntled developers, there might be some disgruntled users and contributors, but for the most part, at this point, they're along for the ride, right? And every time you hard fork, users are forced to upgrade. If they want to keep using the network, and the rest of the network has moved on, like what are you going to do? Start a network of one? Like no, you would literally lose all your money that you have in that protocol. At that point, you have to follow the ongoing hard forks. You have to upgrade. There's no backwards compatibility. That's the whole point about hard forks. That might upset you. You might not like that characterization, but it's just the truth, right? Like what do these words mean? We have to define them clearly. Otherwise, they're useless to us. And you know, like there's this thing. So like this tweet here by Yakumo, he's really pushing back on this framing where I was describing what was going on with BIP 444 as a soft fork. Like it gets activated as a soft fork, but then there's a loosening of consensus rules and after, you know, a period of time. And then that, technically speaking, right, we could classify that loosening of consensus rules as a hard fork. People don't like this classification because they don't want you to define terms clearly. We want to just be general, guys. We don't want to get too specific because then the lies start to emerge. Yakumo has me blocked, so I block him. I always block people that block me just so they can't troll my threads. But he's pushing back on this idea that this temporary soft fork, it's not a lie because it's deterministically part of the proposal. I don't think that this matters at all. I don't think it matters at all that like the BIP 444 proposal programmatically says that it's going to activate this loosening of the consensus rules after, you know, this temporary restriction that it's putting on place. The distributed consensus, right? It's emergent and it's a social consensus. You know, if you want to know of a good example of where this goes already, like you go and look at the Bitcoin Cash fork, how They split off from Bitcoin Core because they were convinced that Bitcoin Core was this corrupt cabal that didn't want Bitcoin to scale. So they were forcibly preventing Bitcoin from scaling on chain. And less than a year later, I think it was, they had already split again into two different networks, BCH and BSV. BSV wanted to increase the block size to 128 megabytes and they were targeting gigabyte blocks, and BCH wanted to like just stick with where they were so that the protocol didn't get too bloated. They wanted a little bit of on-chain scaling, but they didn't want to go that far. And then they wanted to add like a bunch of opcodes and programmability that the BSV people were like, no, Satoshi's original vision that violates the white paper. This is what happens when you create these splinter groups that are like ideologically motivated around technobabble. You get rigid social consensus, and people are going to like it's there's almost no doubt in my mind that if you want to understand what would happen with BIP 444 if it's activated and if it causes this contentious split and if it goes and becomes its own network and then it tries to loosen these consensus rules that the whole split happened over in the first place, there's inevitably going to be some fork of the NOTS protocol that removes that timed activation of the loosening of the consensus rules. I'll call it mechanics vision and code it myself, I guess. I don't know. Guys, we're talking about more than just code. We're talking about more than just tokens. We're talking about more than just economics. We're talking about distributed systems, right? And these distributed systems, they have this very fragile, it's not fragile, it's actually very robust, but it's very hard to stay in consensus in a distributed system, right? There's a lot that can go wrong. But anyway, I think we let me go through these tweets here to make sure that I'm not missing anything here. So yeah, I mean, the whole idea of activating this contentious soft fork that will result in a split sooner or later, right out of the gate, we're already kind of talking about a shift in design posture away from the way Core approaches these things, where, like we talked about yesterday, we're targeting backwards compatibility. We never want to force users to update their software. Like you saw, I don't know if you saw this or not, but BitMEX Research, I wish I had this tweet pulled up, but I don't have it ready. BitMEX Research was running like some 0.8.4 or 6 or something like that, which is like, that's from like 2013, I think, or 2014. They're running that right now just to see what it stays synced with, right? And I guarantee you it's going to stay synced with Core unless we have some catastrophic thing happens that requires a hard fork, necessitates a hard fork. But you see these other protocols, these shitcoins that deviate from this rough consensus change process, they purity spiral into this mess of like marching hard forks and because they're cults of personality, right? I mean, that's the point that we were making about Ethereum yesterday. And people hate this characterization. They hate when you clearly define what these words mean, and it's just a fact of the matter, right? If you have to update your software, like that's a totally different design ethos than we have in Bitcoin Core. You just don't have to do that in Bitcoin, right? Like generally speaking, that's something that we want to avoid. So when you see a protocol that's like 180 pivoting its design philosophy towards abandoning cautious conservatism, by activating a contentious fork like this in the first place, you shouldn't expect them to then proceed forward from there with cautious conservatism. Like, come on, what are we really talking about here? I really liked a lot of these tweets that this Remco guy was saying yesterday in some of these discussions. If you're a nerd and you really want to get in the weeds, I'll link some of those in there. But I do think that there are some good points being made about the fact that technically speaking, BIP 444 is just one binary. If it gets coded up and released, it's just one binary release. And technically speaking, that whole thing, you could just view it as a soft fork and not count the timed loosening of the consensus rules later on down the line as a hard fork. I don't know. To me, we're splitting hairs and just making things harder to understand. Soft fork means tightening consensus rules. Hard fork means loosening consensus rules. We're tightening, then we're loosening, guys. It's not that it's not that hard to understand. We don't need to make it that hard to understand. And I didn't have time to get to this. I wanted to get to this, but Mononaut has some interesting stuff here about how this BIP 444 will disable some coins from being able to be spent on deep Taproot scripts. And because we can't see tap scripts until they're spent, because they all look the same on chain. It's one of the advantages of TapScript is that it gives you better on-chain privacy. you know, this BIP 444 thing could easily brick some UTXOs, and we won't even know. We won't even know till it happens.